Hey everyone, Joshua Gibson here, and you're listening to episode 59 of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to the show's sponsor, BarShield. BarShield created a maintenance kit designed to prevent rust and restore spin to a barbell's sleeves. My discount code, PWPodcast, will get you 10% off of your entire purchase. It will also help me to continue producing great podcasts with amazing guests. Head over to barshieldUSA.com, pick up a kit, and get your bars looking and spinning like new. That's it for the intro. Now let's get on to this week's podcast with Max, Aita. And we are live. Joshua Gibson here with another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm joined today by former weightlifter, powerlifter, and owner of Max's Gym, Max Aita. Max, you're in your car.
Hey.
I can hear your turn signal going.
Hold on. I'm off now.
Okay.
You hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, I hear you good. Yeah.
We're good? Cool.
Yeah. So how's it going, Max?
It's going well. Everything's pretty solid. Nothing particularly amazing going on. Just coaching and doing the regular stuff.
Yeah. So a question I have for you before we kind of dive in, because you've been in strength sports for so long, you've been coaching for such a long time and competing, do you still feel like there's new information that you're running into every day, or do you feel like you're constantly learning something new working with athletes, or just in terms of what you're reading?
I would say that, I used to walk around kind of thinking, hey, everything's been discovered. Everything's kind of, we already have the answers to everything. And I think a lot of that kind of came from, having seen what the Bulgarians did, what the Russians did. Like, we had these records that were huge. But I think that the kind of final frontier of new information that's going to come out is really like how to train drug-free athletes. Because that's something that no one has really researched. Russia never had clean athletes. China, we saw what happened at the Olympics, right? The last two times, it's just a free-for-all. So I think that's probably the one bastion of info that will come out that will become, sort of the new info, the new kind of realm of strength training, or at least for weightlifting.
Yeah, and I actually talked to Sean Waxman about that, and he said his programming has kind of developed in a way where he's trying to exploit the differences between a drug-free athlete and a drug-using athlete, so he can mimic those effects. In your experience and with your time coaching athletes, what do you find is the difference between a drug-free athlete and then a drug-using athlete in terms of training?
Well, I have never coached any drugged-up weightlifters, so I can't answer that. I can say that we do know that the steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs don't necessarily have an impact on the contents of training, meaning they don't change the exercises or the methods used, but they do have an impact on the volume of training. So, people using performance-enhancing drugs will benefit from different amounts of volume. It'll make the training more stimulative. It'll reduce the minimum effective dose of training to the point that it's almost zero, right? We know that people taking anabolics don't have to train to build muscle. So that effectively means that the minimum amount of training you need to do to get stronger and build muscle is zero. That is a huge difference than somebody who's drug-free. If you're drug-free, you have to do quite a bit of training to build muscle, and get stronger. So drugs don't really impact the contents. They don't change the exercises or the methods, but they do impact the volume. They do impact how much is necessary to train, and they impact the amount of training you can do. So drug-free programs versus drug programs should look the same from a content perspective, but different from a magnitude perspective.
Okay. And I guess I kind of wanted to resist asking this question because I feel like it's been overdone. But for those people listening who may not know much about you, I guess it would be useful for you just to give a kind of a quick summary of your background and kind of what led you up to this point, so that when we start unpacking things like programming and how it's changed, people can kind of understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I started as a weightlifter like most people back in the day, where I saw lifting on TV, or someone told me about it, and I kind of started teaching myself how to do the lifts, poorly, of course, as one does, and eventually found a coach, Steve Goff, who was a fantastic guy, a great coach, lifted poorly still, and trained in like a quote unquote Bulgarian style with some really high intensity lifting on a regular basis. I took part-time jobs to sort of manage the ability to train 6 or 7 hours a day. We trained super hard all the time, 6 days a week. And then I eventually ended up working with Abujayev, with the Bulgarian national coach. I came to California to do that. And then, eventually was at Cal Strength in the beginning, and then, started my own thing later. But my experience was mostly like, what's the worst possible way you could train, and what are the most mistakes you could possibly make? And I did all that before I became a coach. So I had, this arsenal of terrible ideas and terrible training, and then I had to reform all of that stuff. And kind of go from there. I always was really interested in training, so I always read a lot about it and coaching and that stuff. I knew about that stuff, even when I was training the way I was training. I just, believe that if you're going to be a good athlete, you have to buy in 100% to what you're doing. So you can't sit there and, I read about how to train properly. I just also understood that it was important to commit to what you were doing, right?
Yeah.
So,
and looking at kind of those different periods of your development, I'd like to know, and I talked to Dave Spitz about this, and of course I won't, as with him, I don't want to stick too much to the Bulgarian aspect of it, because I feel like you flush that out plenty in other places.
Sure.
So if people want to listen to that, they can go find the YouTube videos and the podcast. But in terms of what you've pulled from that experience, what do you still keep with you that you find has been useful and influences the way you approach training, coaching, and competing?
The biggest takeaways, I would say, are one. The biggest takeaways, not in any particular order, are for sure that culture has to match the system. So the American culture is very different than the Bulgarian culture. The American culture is very different than the Russian culture. We're not the same as the Chinese, and trying to copy what a culture has done is just foolish. It's a surefire way to not have success. Americans don't work, as hard as the Chinese. The Americans don't work as hard as the Bulgarians. Americans don't work as hard as the Russians. Vice versa, right? The Russians don't behave like Americans. They don't have the same mentality. They are not as dedicated in certain areas. So it's like there's differences in culture in all these aspects. And applying a system that has grown out of a culture is gonna fail when it's transplanted somewhere else. So that was one huge takeaway. You've got to really establish what your culture is as a team and as a gym and as a coach, and then you'll find athletes that fit that. The other takeaways are probably more grounded in the actual philosophy, is that, you can train poorly as long as you're hitting some of the principles of training properly, meaning, your exercises are specific in selection, your overload is aggressive or it's sufficient, you're managing fatigue, and you can make progress. I mean, I squatted maximum every single day, multiple times a day for years, and I had a strong squat. So it wasn't like you won't make progress. It wasn't like it's the worst thing in the world. It's just I probably could have achieved those same results more efficiently, right? So the other big takeaway would be that, your training is probably dictated more by the fact that you're consistent and willing and aggressive and pushing than it is by the fact that it's really perfect or flawless in its theory. And then the third is that execution is everything. Execution versus ideas. There's, we say this in business a lot, is that there's no market for ideas, right? There's no stock market for ideas because ideas are absolutely worthless. They have no value. Execution is worth a lot of money. Execution is very valuable. There's a stock market for execution, for businesses, right? People that have ideas that turn them into something that's real. And that's something the Bulgarian system, and seeing Abujayev, seeing that whole thing unfold, really resonated with me. That, like, look, the execution of this is the most important thing. Doing it, the way it's designed to be done, actually showing up and fighting for it and doing it will get you results way beyond, creating the perfect system or perfect program and just saying, hey, there it is. We have this awesome, periodization scheme, and every number is calculated, and go ahead and execute it and see what happens, right? Those are probably the biggest takeaways. As far as the actual training process, it's not really very different than most programs. I mean, pretty much every weightlifting program in the world is the same. People do a snatch, clean and jerk, some squatting, some pulling, maybe some other stuff in addition to that. But, weightlifting is not, it's not like a super complicated sport.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things that I did want to touch on that might vary from coach to coach would be the tracking of certain metrics, so volume,
Sure.
in terms of reps, in terms of tonnage. What's your approach to that? Because I've talked to some very, very high-level coaches that don't track anything, and they've had plenty of success. So when it comes to Max's approach to tracking, or your approach to tracking a metric, what is it and why, and then how do you implement that tracking?
So there's really, like, you can only really track one thing, right? You're tracking training load, and it's a matter of how detailed your assessment of that load is. So load would be, a very basic measurement of training load would be like tonnage, like number of reps and sets times the weight, right? A more detailed version of that would be like sets and reps times the weight, but for each specific exercise to account for, the distance the bar travels, being different in a snatch than in a jerk. And then another more detailed version would be like, number of lifts done, tonnage done, distributed into each intensity, and then finding an average intensity, right? And that's kind of like where the Russians sort of, the pinnacle of where they got to with training load, right? We have number of lifts, distribution of intensities across different zones of intensity, and then an average intensity based off of that. And the Russian system is about kind of manipulating that average intensity. What I've looked for is, depending on the athlete, certain athletes do really well with higher volume programs that are of lower intensity or of higher intensity. Some people do well with programs that are really, really low volume and very, very high intensity. So depending on the person, I generally track the intensity and the volume and then find an average intensity on some level. It depends who it is, though, right? Someone like really consistent lifter like Alyssa or like, Alex a Chance, we establish that, we build that program out, find that volume, the average intensity, and then start to work off of that. Someone who trains much, much less consistently, like maybe James or Kiana, where they're training a couple times a week and it's hit and miss sometimes. It's difficult to track that because then you're always looking to correct it. Oh, okay, like, hey, we have, an average intensity is going up or going down, but it's affected so much because if you have 2 workouts in a week and you miss one, right, that just throws everything off. So the biggest landmarks to really track, in my opinion, if you're going to distill things down, is to really keep track of the high intensity lifts. Is how often are we taking lifts over 90%, right? And how many of them are we taking? And that without a doubt has the highest correlation to your results. I mean, it goes without saying, right? If you train with the heaviest weights, you're going to be the strongest. So from my perspective, what I'm concerned with is looking at looking at the average intensity, looking at the total volume, and manipulating that based on what the athlete needs. If someone's too slow, we do lighter lifts and we do more of that. If someone's really, really technically sound and weak, we do more high intent or more heavy lifts. But in general, what we're looking at is what are the number of heavy lifts that someone's taking in any one period of time.
Okay, and would you say there's a general intensity range that you tend not to get away from? So regardless of the person, you're always looking to be within 75 to 85% for a majority of training, or 80 to 90, or you're working to at least get a few lifts every mesocycle within that 80 to 90% range. Is there like a general recommendation you have there?
Well, that all depends on what phase of training you're in, right? There's no need to be at any one stage of training year round. And if you are at any one period of training year round and maintaining a certain ability year round or for any period of time, that's the definition of a plateau, right? If you're always at 90% or you can always hit 90%, you're basically at a plateau. You should be at up and down, right? There should be fluctuations. So, there is no requirement that somebody is at a certain level of performance for the year. It just depends on what that person needs. A great example is that someone who competes really frequently, like let's say you're making world teams or Pan Am teams, but you're not like the number 1 seed, you're the number 8 or 9, you're going to have to compete regularly, right? You're going to have to do a lot of meets to qualify for these things. And in that case, there's just no time for you to train and build up accumulate a huge amount of volume in the period after a competition, because you got to get ready for the next one. So you're basically going to have to be at a relatively high intensity on a regular basis. Somebody who's developing still, who has not made those teams, or is basically like, shooting to make a medal at nationals, or they maybe do 2 big meets a year, they have the luxury of being able to do a lot more training volume and keep that intensity relatively low for a long period of time to develop those qualities, and then they can really peak and ramp up for the big meets. So it just depends on the overall yearly structure of someone's competition calendar.
Yeah, and anecdotally speaking, I was on a very, very high intensity program, high intensity, high frequency program, and I noticed that I could always come in and snatch like 97%, 98% without any misses, but put 101% on the bar, and it would never go. And it's the most frustrating thing.
Right. And, a lot of times I think weightlifting is, for a long time, people thought of weightlifting like powerlifting, right? And it's like, it's very similar. But it's really, weightlifting is very, very similar to throwing. It's much more similar to throwing than any other sport that I can think of. Because, for one, obviously it's ballistic, right? The barbell's moving, out of your control, or, it's becoming airborne. And unlike powerlifting, which only has one particular quality to train, force production is all that matters in powerlifting. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be explosive. You simply have to be able to produce an enormous amount of force. And weightlifting has multiple facets to it. There's a speed component, there's a technique component, and there's a very large psychological component. So you have to kind of coordinate all these things together. When you have programs that are really high intensity, you satisfy some of those demands. When you're training really heavy all the time, you become confident with big weights, right? You start getting consistent and comfortable, like, hey, 95% is like not that hard, right? 90% is like, I can do it every day. And you're conditioned for that. You're also conditioned for the technique that you use. You become really comfortable with it and you execute it really consistently. But the downside to training at that level all the time is that you have a very difficult time developing new functional levels of explosive strength or general strength. And so while you can do those heavy weights all the time, you haven't developed a situation where your body your body is adapting to more stressful loads and becoming more and more powerful, and therefore, allowing you to lift bigger weights. So you kind of, again, become like plateaued at that point. Does it make sense? Where it's like, you're hitting, I know exactly what you mean, when you hit 95%, 97%, even 100% all the time, but you're never going to be above that. You've become great at that, but not great at pushing your body beyond that level.
No, that makes 100%, or that makes 100% of sense. And I actually found, because my leg strength tended to be the limiting factor for me. I could sneak under those 97% lifts, but I couldn't develop anything that would allow me to get more height on the bar,
Right.
and allow me to lift bigger weights. So if we're looking for a plan that is going to be more beneficial in the long run, say we have a 6-month period between major competitions for someone that's at a national level, maybe top 10 or 15 to 10, what would that plan look like in terms of sequencing training to maximize progress throughout the 6 months, and not just maybe for 5 or 6 weeks where they're able to hit 100% lifts but not really improve on that?
Well, from a basic structural standpoint, or like a phasic structure, what you're going to want to do is, when you have 6 months or so, a long period of time, you have to do an assessment of the athlete. What does this athlete need from a technical standpoint? What do they need from a motor quality standpoint? What do they already possess in terms of strengths and weaknesses? And then what other, tactical or psychological preparation is necessary? So you start always with the most general basic qualities, GPP and general strength and mobility and those kind of things. Work at those, and then sequence from there into more complex, more specific, more intense training as you get closer to the competition. You're always going to do competitive exercise. There's no way around snatch and clean and jerk at some point in training, right? There's almost like a catch-22 in that the more stabilized your technique becomes, the less you need to practice it. But by the time your technique is highly stable, the only things that will induce further progress are going to be the most specific means. So, yeah, while you become more and more consistent with snatch and clean and jerk, and you become better and better at it, doing general training, like making your squat bigger or making your pulls and those kind of movements stronger, will have less and less of an effect on you, because you already have a level of general strength that's adequate. So as somebody becomes more and more developed, this catch-22 situation comes up where their training has to start mimicking higher specificity, basically looking more and more the same for a longer and longer period of time in order to actually facilitate progress. And at some point, the amount of volume you can do to get better, the limit of your ability to train, and the minimum amount of training you have to do to improve, those 2 points will eventually converge. And you'll be at a point where you have to do more training than you can possibly recover from in order to develop more strength or more power in the lifts. And at that point, won the world championships. But everybody gets to that point, right? So your program should look like general in nature in the beginning, maximize those qualities, develop what you can, work on the hierarchy of technical things, position first, timing, tempo, rhythm, speed, intensity, and then go from there to the next phase of, now it's time to start overloading the Olympic lifts more aggressively, developing more consistent technique, more stabilized technique, and then, elimination of all the training volume from general exercises and shifting that more into actual competitive exercise like snatch and clean and jerk with near maximum weights, to the point that you peak and then compete. And that time frame just looks different for every person, depending on, what they possess as an athlete, what their goals are, what they need to accomplish.
Okay, so if we're looking to, say someone needs to put on a lot of muscle mass or lean tissue, you're looking to string blocks together that are more focused on developing that. How often would you revisit, say, heavy squats, heavy snatches, heavy clean and jerks, so that you're not getting away from it too much? So are you looking to maybe implement some sort of strength block between the two? I guess what I'm trying to get at is how often would you revisit a quality that's not being trained or focused on? Or what's the minimum effective dose within a block to maintain it?
So that those factors. So first off, the minimum effective dose to maintain training is going to be different based on each athlete, right? So, the athletes that are able to stimulate themselves more, meaning stronger athletes lifting bigger weights that are more explosive, taller, longer limbs, et cetera, will have to do less in order to maintain those results. If you squat 300 kilos, you don't have to do very many squat workouts to maintain a 300 kilo squat, right? You can squat 600 pounds or 270 kilos for a few sets every week and probably maintain your strength. If you squat 100 kilos and you weigh 100 kilos, you could lose most of that strength pretty much, maybe 100 kilos too low, but you squat 150 kilos and you weigh 100, if you stop squatting for a few weeks, you might lose most of that strength. So minimum effective dose is just going to be determined by how strong the individual is, all those other factors, how explosive, how stimulative their training is. The more it is, the more you are on that advanced side, the less you have to do to maintain the qualities you have. So if we look at athletes like top level weightlifters, someone who has a 180 kilo snatch and a 225 kilo clean and jerk, that person has to do very, very little to maintain their technique, to maintain their strength levels, so they can focus more intensely on one quality over the other. The more beginner a lifter is, the more they're just learning or very, very low qualification, the less time they can take away from those things. So a beginner's program should look like mostly the skill that they're trying to develop with a combination of all qualities involved. So, if you're a beginner, you're going to do mostly snatch and clean and jerk, and you're not going to get away from those very often because you don't have enough training under your belt to leave that stuff on the table and come back to it and have it be the same. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So, beginners programs and intermediate programs really get into this place where a lot of it is that you're trying to work a lot of things all at the same time because you can't take a big step away from any one thing for too long. If you look at, most people probably understand the difference between the Russian program or the Soviet model and the Bulgarian model. And we can define those simply as the Soviet model is a lot of variety. Most motor qualities are trained all the same time. And the distribution of training is really relatively even across the board. The Bulgarian model is really skewed towards very specific, high intensity, aggressive on the strength exercises, very aggressive on the loading and the Olympic lifts. You basically have a situation like a horseshoe where the beginner is at one end of that horseshoe. They're doing a program that looks like a Bulgarian program because they just need to do basically snatch and clean and jerk to learn the movements. They spend a lot of time developing that. They don't spend any time away from that. And their strength exercises, unlike a Bulgarian system, their strength exercises are going to be basically just exercises to help facilitate learning the technique and protecting their joints, protecting injury-prone muscles, but very, very minimal. They don't need a lot of it. The other side of that horseshoe would be like the Bulgarians, right, or Ilya Ilin's program, mostly snatch, clean and jerk, and squat. Really, really heavy all the time. Now in the middle, intermediate lifters basically have to work at fixing all their weaknesses, fixing all their muscular weaknesses, developing technique through the use of exercises that correct strength imbalances, and teach them the conceptual model of technique properly. So their program is going to look way more like this Russian model where they don't want to focus too much energy on any one of those qualities. They don't need to spend a ton of time on snatch, clean, and jerk. They need to do everything under the sun to develop the correct technique and fix their weaknesses, along with maintaining the development of strength and other qualities all together. So you have this weird, kind of situation where as a beginner, you do basically the same kind of training that advanced people do, obviously much less intense. And as an advanced lift, you do what beginners do, just more intensely. But in the middle there, you're going to have this very different kind of system, very different kind of program. And that mimics, I think, what a lot of lifters do when you see them, the European guys, mimics what Ilya Ilin told us. They do a lot of variety in the beginning. They do a lot of exercises, but they focus mostly on learning the technique. They get to this middle age range, 10, 12 years old through 16, 18, where they're focusing on the Soviet model. It's all qualities trained very, very evenly, development of balance and training and structure, and then they finish that and they become strong, and then they focus entirely on the sport result, which is, snatch and clean and jerk and squats.
Okay, so I have a few questions there, and
Yeah.
it's always going to be kind of tough to come up with an answer because, as we've kind of heard over and over, everything's individual to the person.
Right.
But when we're talking beginners, I'm sure everyone listening is kind of wondering what that classification looks like in terms of
Yeah.
maybe not so much numbers, but percentages or ratios, so that they know when they can start making that transition from a snatch, clean and jerk focused program to something
I
with
have
more variety.
so my definition of beginners, this is how I classify people in these different categories. Now, probably it wasn't wise to use the term beginner, intermediate, advanced, because those could also apply to the amount of weight you lift. But what we're looking for in the classification of beginner, intermediate, advanced is the stabilization of their technique. A beginner has inconsistent technique, meaning that if you have out of, let's say, 100 misses, not every single one of them is the same. You might miss 100 different lifts in the span of like a week, and 15 of them are in front, 12 are behind, 6 are press outs, 12 of them come from different reasons. You moved your feet differently, or they're all different. There's an inconsistency there. An intermediate lifter is someone whose technique is now stabilized. Every single time they miss, or most times they miss, they make the same error. That error is now a byproduct of a muscular weakness. You miss forward because you get behind the bar, or you jump forward, or you swing it every time because you use your hips too much. So intermediate and beginner are differentiated simply by how stable the technique is. An advanced lifter is a lifter whose technique is now completely stabilized to the point where if they stopped training the lift and took any period of time off, they could come back and continue training with the same technique they had before. You could think of that as it's like riding a bike, right? You just know how to do it. It's the same. You've developed it. It's become a neurological component of your brain, right? You just show up and perform, and every time you snatch, it's the same. You have a very difficult time changing it. In fact, you couldn't come back after 3 months off and snatch totally differently. So those are the 3 levels, right? Is the stabilization of technique and the consistency. And each level is going to be determined by, how it is relative to the other levels. If you're a beginner and you come in and you're missing lifts differently every time, then your number one goal is to stabilize your technique and start having the same correctable error every time, right? Once you get to that point, it's time to now focus on the muscular weaknesses of why you're having that error, and then develop exercises and use them to fix that. And then once you've stabilized that and you've become ingrained, then that's the case.
Yeah, and I guess kind of looking at a program for a beginner, I've talked to a few different coaches, and they tend to be of the mindset that they don't like verbal cues to correct a technical issue. So if we're developing a program for a beginner, are we looking to program in drills along with the full lifts, or is it just kind of like let them do the full lift, become comfortable? Are you more on the side of using cues to correct something in the moment and then just letting the full lift iron itself out to the point of, okay, here's something that they consistently do wrong and have done wrong, and their technique is stabilized, so let's start going towards an approach with more variety to correct it?
So from a beginner standpoint, I don't believe that it's wise to eliminate any modality, any tool you could use. I think that it's really easy to overuse cues and verbal coaching and have that be really ineffective. But a lot of times for beginners, the reality is that if it's your first week in the gym, the only knowledge you have of a snatch or a clean and jerk, the only experience you have is what other people tell you or what you've watched, right? So you're largely learning the technique by verbal means. People are explaining to you what you're supposed to do. So it's necessary to be able to convey how to do a snatch or clean and jerk by explaining it to somebody. Just having them mimic it might work for some athletes. It might not for others, right? Some people are very visual learners. Some people are not. And so not having the ability to explain and give these athletes the conceptual idea of what the technique should be could easily end up in a situation where you're just, you've got a lifter who does it 98% right or 90% right, but they have this one little weird tick or thing and you never really fixed it and they don't understand why it's that way. And then you end up with, they're going to deviate to the least difficult technique they can use, right? So I think it's really important that you understand to communicate the conceptual model of technique to a lifter first, explain to them how to do the lift, educate them on what they're trying to do and how to do it. And cueing really helps with a lot of that stuff. I think that the excessiveness is like giving beginners cues that you use for advanced people. Telling a beginner to stay over the bar or to, do this or do that, like some weird thing where they may not even have an understanding of what that means, right? Start them with, hey, here's this position. Put your body in this place. Here's what the action should feel like. Make it feel like this. Or, put your body weight here, et cetera. Like basic stuff like that, I think, is really effective. As far as just giving them exercises to fix that, I mean, you and I, both know that you could give somebody an exercise and they'll fuck it up 100 different ways. That's a surefire way to end up, getting somebody to not do what you want.
Yeah, and I guess out of curiosity now, how much does your usage of verbal cues change from beginner to intermediate to advanced? And then when you have a high level athlete, how much do you talk to them within a session about what's going on with their technique?
So every one of my top lifters is a remote athlete. I don't have anyone that I coach in person right now. We do see them in person at camps and stuff, but the reality is that that's a unique situation because, you have to basically educate them as to what they need to do and make them as autonomous as possible so they understand how to correct things and how to do things. Probably the fastest way to get them to understand that, to eliminate the need to coach them, is to have them coach other people and encourage them to teach people, because once you start teaching, you become very critical of what you're trying to get someone to do, and you have to analyze it, right? When you get to the point where you're a good enough coach or an experienced enough coach or athlete to where you could explain what's happening every inch of the lift or every moment of the lift, then you're going to start to have enough, forethought to include those descriptions in your own mind when you're lifting. If you don't know, if you're completely oblivious to like what you're supposed to do or feel, then you're up shit creek as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you're going to have a hard time. So I really encourage them to teach other people, to watch other lifting, to try to embody a lot of that stuff and internalize those things so they can grasp the finer points of technique. That eliminates the need for a lot of cueing or a lot of coaching. I also believe, every athlete's different. Some people thrive off of giving a little bit of information. Some people, just too much anxiety and focus, and you say one thing and it snowballs into a mess, right? So that's really individualized, but I would really focus on a little bit less cueing, I think, is better. The better you are, the more stable your technique, the less cueing is going to have an impact, right? Telling someone to stay on their heels when they haven't done that for the last 6 years is probably not going to just magically change. Like, I just stayed over the bar and there it was. So a lot of it is just assessments and knowing what your athlete is and is not, and dialing in your coaching for that.
Okay, and I guess this is a great segue to a section of the podcast where we can discuss technique. I understand that there are a lot of non-negotiables when it comes to performing the lifts. Obviously, you need to start in almost the same position from person to person. You need to be in a certain position at the knee and then at the hip to perform the lift most efficiently. So when you're teaching someone technique, what are the things they must do in order to perform a successful lift? And then what varies from person to person?
The things they have to do are within the technical rule book of the IWF, right? So we have to start there when we assess the technique. What does someone have to do? They have to comply to the rules. So press outs, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very vague rule book, but that's the basic beginning, right? From there, you look at what are the most fundamental aspects of lifting that are just essential, which we all discuss, is like the bar has to be close to your body. You have to maximize the use of as many muscle groups as possible to make your lifting as powerful as possible, right? Just using your low back versus just using your legs. Obviously, neither one of those is going to be, an advantage if you can use both together. So coordination, basic stuff like that. As far as the actual positions go, there's definitely variance in that. Some people who have very, very strong legs will try to use their legs more. Some people who have very, very strong backs will use their backs more. But fundamentally, there's the 6 or 7 phases of the lift that are executed are always the same, right? You can't get away from the fact that everybody starts with their knees bent, then straightens them, bends them again, extends their hips and legs violently together, turns the hands over. Like those things all happen. The degree to which they happen is essentially up in the air, as it depends on the athlete, right? How much does somebody use their legs versus their back, or what are the angles to which they extend their legs or rebend their knees? Those things are really like independent and very much heavily dependent on the anatomy of the lifter. As far as like individual landmarks that I look for in terms of lifting, a lot of it is just a matter of how efficient they are. How high are they pulling the bar versus how low are they receiving the weight? Are they maximizing that are they maximizing that component of lifting? It doesn't mean that we're striving for any particular number in those scenarios. Like you have to pull it this high and catch it this low. We're looking to say, is there an area here that this person could improve on? Are you receiving the bar really, really high and riding it down to a squat? Or are you cutting your pull really bad and you really would do better generating a little more force because you'd be more consistent and make more lifts? But as far as technique goes, those are the things we're looking for: is gross errors first, and just essentially the most basic principles. Making sure they execute the lift in all phases correctly, or as close to correct as possible, meaning efficient. Distributing power properly, timing is proper, positions are within an acceptable range. There was a few years ago, there was that Kazakhstani guy, I want to say like 2014 Worlds, like he kind of came out of nowhere, and there's a slow-mo hook grip video of him, and he was the most rugged fucking lifter I've ever, you're sure if you search for it, you'd find it. This guy like shoved his hips and knees forward and down to meet the bar. Like,
oh yeah.
Like it was like dramatic, more than anyone's ever seen. And the guy clean jerked like 197. I'm sure he was gassed out of his mind, but still, like, there's this example of this bizarre execution of the lift, really odd. But the guy possessed whatever neurological qualities and explosive strength to be able to execute it, and he lifted like that. And who knows, he grew up in a country that is, famous for weightlifting. So how many times did coaches say to him, your lift looks like shit. You're terrible at this. But he kept doing it, right? And he kept executing it this weird way until he got to this level of strength. So there's always that caveat that, like, some people do things differently. And you might not understand exactly why, but if it, you ever read Charlie Francis was?
Yeah.
The if it looks right, it flies right. Right? Sometimes there's just people that do that just are a little bit different, a little bit odd. I say that, and then 20 people that are listening will be like, "Oh yeah, well Max said that like it it can be a little bit different. So my shitty snatch where I jump forward 2 feet is fine." I mean, like, there are some exceptions, and you'll know you're an exception because people will want your autograph, and they'll come up to you and tell you about how awesome you are because you're probably also a freak. But, certainly there are exceptions.
Yeah, I was actually I've been watching a lot of Podium Gold YouTube videos, and Hassan.
The old Podium Gold.
Yeah, and like Hassan's pull where his knees cave and he's like extremely over the bar. It's just, I don't know how he was able to clean and jerk so much doing that, but if you look at like old videos when he was like 13 or 12 or whatever, he was doing that exact same thing. So he's been doing it for such a long time.
That he's a great example, and I don't mean to say anything that's critical of anyone, but he's a great example of like, he started at 12 or 13, and he started the full program at probably 12 or 13, like most of the European guys did, meaning that he had all the supplementation from day one, all the aggressive training from day one. And you have to imagine what that does to the execution of the sport, right? If you played American football and you played it with kids, you played like, let's say, touch football, right, or flag football for 10 years, 15 years, and then you played regular tackle football, it would be a different world. And everything about the way you execute the sport is totally different. Even though it's the same basic rules, it's totally different. So imagine that you take up the sport of lifting, and from day one, you're already at super physiological levels of ability. How different does that make the sport for you, right? Psychologically, your approach to everything is going to be impacted by that stuff, especially if you're a kid, especially if you're young. So then it becomes like, okay, what is the compound effect of that over the course of 10 years? And what does that do? And you get a lifter like Hussein, or get a lifter like, that guy, the Kazakh guy, where like they're very different. It's a very different execution. It's not like a guy who trained for 10 years and developed perfect technique and then was like, I'm going to take some steroids and start lifting and just became a little bit stronger. You're talking about a very different animal, right? So I think it's interesting to look at that and be like, yeah, hey, how much of this stuff is that we just get away, or the system just kind of produces these oddities, these sort of, strange looking things that are not what you would get any other way.
Okay, and so if we're looking at someone that is getting into the sport at an older age, so late teens, early 20s, are we always working towards this middle ground of having a completely coordinated use of the body in terms of having equal strength of the legs, the quads, the hips, the back, coordinating the pull in such a way that it kind of comes to this climax of being incredibly vertical? Or are we like looking at someone's individual differences or their tendencies and just trying to develop those? So if someone tends to use their hips more, we just get their hips extremely strong and bring their quads up to a point that's manageable? Or what's your opinion on that if that question makes sense?
So that's really what your question comes down to, is what is the best strategy? Because both of those are just descriptions of a strategy. And that's actually kind of goes a little further to like the Bulgarian system, Russian system, Chinese system. Those aren't systems. I mean, yes, they are systems, but they're strategies. China's strategy is, let's get a lot of people, put them through this program, use this philosophy of training, blah, blah, blah. Russia had a strategy. I mean, we saw Russia's strategy in the movie Icarus, right? That was their strategy. We're going to use drugs and we're not going to stop. So you take a lifter that comes to an American coach and they say, hey, I'm 20 years old. I do this, this, and this, yada, yada, yada. I would, as a coach, I would look at their personality, discuss with them what they want to try to achieve, and then talk to them about what is the best strategy for you based on the situation you're in. Because you're not in a situation like you would be if you were 12 years old in Russia. You're 20 years old, you have a job, you have a life. How interested are you going to be? At some point, you can't be a 55-year-old weightlifter, or really like a 25 or 35-year-old weightlifter who's just grinding away for that next world team spot. Like, get in, get out, have a life outside of this, be a contributing member to society, and decide what is the best strategy. If you're a guy who's, super well-suited, or a girl who's well-suited to train like a Bulgarian, then that's probably not a bad strategy for you. If you're not well-suited to that, if psychologically you just, you're more timid, you're more thoughtful, you're more analytical, you prefer to kind of hone your craft and work at it, and you like more variety in those things, that's not a good strategy for you. So I think it's really important that you address the athlete and decide what is the best strategy for this person and then go with that. Certainly different lifters should have different approaches. It just goes without saying that, not every person that's on the same team should look identical. And if they do, it's probably because the people that don't look like that or can't lift like that don't make the team.
That's very interesting. So how much do you think a mindset or the psychology of a person can be coaxed into the other extreme? So if you have someone that is more timid or thoughtful, how much do you think there's like an exposure therapy where if you just expose them to the Bulgarian system for a long enough period of time, eventually it's going to kind of mold their psychology into being able to excel on that or with that method?
Yeah. Imagine, I think the best analogy for that would be like, imagine you go to boot camp in the Marines and you're 17 years old. Really moldable, right? You're going to leave boot camp a completely changed person, and you're going to be very different. Imagine you go to boot camp when you're 45. It's not going to have any impact. I mean, you might toughen up and, have a different perspective, but that's 6 months out of your life or whatever it is that is not going to, probably not going to change you that much. So I think you have to really assess, like, hey, how moldable is this person based on how much life experience they have. You get someone who comes in who's like, I can think of I can think of a lifter out there who's got a very rabid following, right? You look at, I don't want to name names or anything, but some people have very rabid followings that are just like, they will do anything, and they are a very, very strong fan base. Those people may be looking for something. They're looking for that, like, I need this thing in my life. And when they find it and it's like this super aggressive training program and they're like, this guy is the Messiah, he knows everything, I'm going to this is the guy. They fall in line, right? They're just susceptible to that. And so that's, sure, you could change some people's personalities. The younger someone is, the more moldable they are, then for sure you could change that. The question becomes, is that, if that's the case, then what are you going to mold it into? Are you going to mold them into somebody who's a super aggressive kind of Bulgarian style training thing? Or are you going to mold them into somebody who, buys into this different approach? Right?
So there's two questions I have. One would be when you're looking at the athlete, or they come to you and you're asking questions to reveal their personality or what training method would be best for them. Do you have any questions you tend to go to, or is it just kind of like you just kind of listen and start to piece things together, or do you expose them to different types of training? What's your approach for figuring out what's best for an individual athlete besides their physical qualities?
The first thing you do is just talk to them, have a conversation, right? Most of coaching is about communication and connecting with people. And that can be said that anytime I've coached somebody and that it fell apart was because of communication primarily. But it's like you communicate with them and get an idea for how they are as a person, and then you train them and you see how they lift and how they perform and how they react to, different levels of adversity or different types of situations. If somebody is frustrated and they get really angry and they start, behaving a certain way, then okay, that. If somebody, just quits because it's too tough, or they get stuck and they can't stop thinking, then that. So I think a lot of it is just watching them lift and behave, and the questions are less important as much as searching for what their reaction to those things are.
And then if you found someone who's more fitted towards the higher intensity approach, how do you keep them injury free, relatively speaking, to allow them to progress if that is best for their tendencies, their psychology, all of those other qualities? Because it's going to be very, very aggressive on their body, their joints, and without all of the supplementary work to kind of shore them up, so to speak, it's got to be tough to manipulate everything in a way that keeps them healthy for an extended period of time.
So that would be a prerequisite of the person who's going to do that. It's going to have to be somebody who's very durable and who's very hardy, if that word makes sense. But you're looking for someone who's pretty tough physically, because it is just like that. there are lifters that are extraordinarily talented and are very delicate, and a little bit of this or that, or they get injured really easily, or seemingly so, and they may just not have those qualities where they can endure a tremendous amount of training. Other lifters, you will see themselves, they'll grind themselves to pieces every day and never get a single boo-boo or anything. When I squatted every day and trained with Goff and Abajev for, well over a decade, I never had a single knee or soft tissue injury or back injury, anything. And, I trained super hard that way. My upper body was not that way. My upper body got destroyed, but my legs and hips they were very, very robust. I could tolerate that kind of training. And so that's probably a prerequisite of the type of person that would do that.
Okay. And then I guess outside of training in terms of programming and technique, do you have any restorative modalities that you tend to tell your athletes to use often, and what are your favorites for your athletes?
What a lot of that is should be kind of periodized. So you would do like your recovery, your most intense and you would do most of your recovery means and modalities in the hardest weeks of training or after the hardest weeks of training, rather than like year round. It wouldn't be smart to do hot and cold contrast baths, ice baths, those kind of things, or sauna all the time. You'd want to do them at the times that are most necessary, or you get the most benefit right after your hardest training. But aside from that, the one thing that, personally, I never, my warm up consisted of walking up to the bar. I never did anything. I never stretched. Even to this day, like I never, and I'm old and beat up and broken. Like I might do a couple of air squats and then squat. Like I just never did that stuff. And I never, I also don't believe, wholly that that's the most important thing. I do think that the most important stuff is that you set yourself up for success with, establishing the right habits of warming up properly, getting your body ready to lift, doing certain things. One of the big things we have our team do is these breathing drills and bracing drills. Spending a lot of time working on those things will kind of, I think, augment the fact that augment your ability to recover, because you're able to get to a place where you're relaxing and get to a place where you're able to focus on, your actual breathing rather than just stopping a workout and getting cold and hot and then, watching TV for 2 hours. Anytime you're able to go from a really excited state to a very relaxed state, you're going to recover better. So those kind of things are really important to me, is that people are taking the proper process of actually relaxing and taking their mind off of lifting and taking as much stress off themselves as possible. And then the actual recovery methods are the same things most people do, right? Contrast baths, hot water, cold water, obviously nutrition and supplementation and diet is obviously huge, and then, there's like the massage stuff. As much as like we want that stuff to all be amazing, it's kind of, it's probably an up in the air kind of thing. Again, it probably falls more into that category of relaxation and positive thinking. If you're doing massage and you feel like it's helping and you feel like that act is a good thing, then yeah, it's probably going to help. But as far as it doing anything to you, it's probably, on the side of less significant. And then, whatever other modalities people want to do, I'm always fine with those things. I'm not a huge like, spiritual, like kind of like, hey, let's like go and do this, like, wheatgrass and stuff like. I'm just more of like I watched the Bulgarians, and granted they were always the drug thing, but like, those guys were like, some of them were like, your thought is like, oh shit, like these guys have everything dialed in, right? It's all like, they know every single thing, and it's just not like that. They're just going outside smoking in between sets and and like, oh, I don't like massage, it feels weird. And you're like, man, my whole perception of professional weightlifting was built around them getting massages every day. And like some of the guys are like, I don't like them, I don't do that. So it's like, how important are those things? Probably to some degree, yeah, but to others, like, it's probably not as significant as people want to make it.
Yeah, and I think we're in an age where the accessibility to not only information but services is so great. So you can have a massage therapist, a chiropractor, a physical therapist. You can have a nutritionist. You can have all these different people that you use to quote unquote improve your training. How much massaging, no pun intended, of the athlete do you do to convince them that the fundamentals are what matter, and a lot of this stuff, this shit is just excess? Like, do you have that discussion with your athletes, or is it kind of like if they feel better, if they think it works, whatever they do, it doesn't really matter? Because as you know, it's all about managing stress. That's what training is. It's managing stress in the body. So if you don't have an ability to manage the stress from the physical therapist or the massage therapist or their psychiatrist, it's difficult to understand what kind of load they're actually experiencing. So what's your opinion on that?
I try to get people to believe in accountability and to really put themselves in a place where they take ownership of and responsibility for their actions and the things that they do. I think when you adopt a philosophy of responsibility and ownership, that then that when you actively go out and pursue things that will help you, you're going to feel better for that. You're going to feel positive about your actions. If you walk around with a victim mentality in that things happen to me, when you go and get a massage, you see it as a negative consequence of the fact that you fucked something up and now you got to fix it. And so I don't think that's going to do as much good for you. So I think a huge part of getting people to buy into the basics and the individual, the little stuff, is about first and foremost taking responsibility for themselves and having accountability for themselves. It's not my job, as much as we see coaches a certain way. It's not my job to make sure that you're doing the lifts, correctly, that you're executing the technique properly. That's your job. It's your technique, right? It's your responsibility to execute the lift properly. It's my job to help you get from point A to point B. If you're doing something wrong in the lift technically because you're lazy or you're not trying hard enough, then I'm going to let you know, hey, you did that wrong. Now you need to fix that, right? If you went to any other job, any other sport, if you were in the NFL, right, and you're not doing it correctly, the coach will say, hey, do it right. Do it this way. And if you still don't do it right, but you have the ability to, then you're just, you're not taking responsibility for it. You're messing yourself up. You're messing up the whole thing. So giving people that gift of responsibility and accountability makes the little things a big deal. When you set up for the bar, are you close to the bar? Are you every single time putting in an extra second to make sure you're in the right place to do things a little bit better than you did the last time? Are you taking every opportunity you have, every lift, to really make the most out of your lifting session today and your technique and your strength and all that stuff? If you're accountable and responsible, you're going to do that on your own. And so it doesn't require that I sit there having to convince you it's a good idea, right? We all know that the goal is, the Olympics or Worlds or whatever. So if I say, hey, it's important to do it right, you have to keep the bar close, and you need someone to consistently remind you and coax you to do it, you probably don't care that much about the end goal, right? I think that might be a harsher opinion than some people might have, but I just believe that the only people that are going to get to that level are the people that are craving that kind of thing, that you want so badly to do it better. You put every single bit of energy you have into all the little pieces, and you hold yourself responsible for it. If you don't have that already, you better have an incredible amount of talent, because it's so hard to get to those levels. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but
Well, what's interesting about that is I've been having those thoughts. Like, I share the exact same sentiment. I've been thinking that for the longest time, but I haven't been able to kind of put it into words. And you were able to do that incredibly well. So, for everyone listening, like, that's golden. I think I'm right on level with that. I agree completely. And I actually had a podcast recently. Shout out to Jocelyn Forrest of Catalyst Athletics, but she was talking about how much she just enjoys the work. And she played softball, and she said she would throw, like, I don't remember if it was 2,000 or 200 pitches, but she would throw it to the same spot in the strike zone. She'd feel her fingers on the laces in a certain way, and she would throw it in a certain way to get the desired result. And she just enjoyed that about it, like every single repetition. And like when I hear that, that's the mindset of someone that as a coach you want. Like that's a person you really want, because they're going to fulfill their end of being incredibly focused on every rep, every set, every workout.
You know, the thing that we really try to adopt and we really try to instill in all the people on the team is the idea that we are process oriented. We are not goal oriented. Our training, our system, our coaching, everything we do is not goal oriented. The goal is the present at the end. The process is what's important. Every day you need to come in. If you want to get to the Olympics, you know, the best analogy for process orientation versus goal orientation is that someone who has a goal oriented mentality goes in the gym every day and their goal is to snatch a PR or snatch 100 kilos. And every time they don't snatch 100 kilos in the gym, which is going to be a lot of times, they've failed to reach their goal, right? And they have no metric for gauging whether or not they're going to get to their goal or not. They just know they haven't gotten there. Every time you go into the gym, if you have process orientation, your goal should be to improve the littlest thing you can improve. And it all starts with stuff that you have control of. Well, you don't have control of your genetics. You don't have control of, you know, how you're going to feel that day, but you do have control of whether or not you tried to get good sleep, whether or not you had good nutrition, whether or not you had a positive mental attitude when you went in the gym, whether or not you reviewed your training and decided, okay, here's how I'm going to approach it. Here's my strategy for the day. Here's my plan. I'm going to attack it like this, this, and this. If it goes well, I'm going to do this. If it doesn't go well, I'm going to do this. All those things are things that if you keep applying those every day to training, if you keep going to the gym with the intent that you're going to make the smallest thing that you have control over better, that will snowball into more and more things getting better. And then your process is very easy to replicate. Every day you show up, I'm going to do a great job of my snatches today. I'm going to do a great job setting up in the start position. I'm going to take extra time on the jerk. I'm going to make sure I set up these things. Those are all three things that you can do with, doesn't really cost you anything in training. It's no extra training volume. It's no extra time. It's effort. It's simply putting in that work to do a great job on the little things. If you do that over and over and over again, the process will yield the result. The process will yield the goal, because you'll end up having a great snatch because you focused on the technique. You'll end up having really good workouts because you focused on being positive every time you walk in the gym. You'll have success because you're always focused on the process rather than what's the end result. Any asshole can go in the gym and say, I'm going to squat 300 kilos. But the guy who goes in, who's, trying to improve his squat every day and focusing on that, is probably going to get there a lot faster.
Yeah. And you see this a lot in the gym, just speaking with different athletes, because you'll talk to some that are just focused on the turnover. So I need to keep the next rep close. I'm going to do a better job of turning over a little bit faster or whatever. And then you'll talk to someone else and they're like, I really need that Wilks score or that Sinclair. Yeah. And I really need this number. And it's like, but we have so much time between these 2 points.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you can have that in your mind when you're a month out, 2 months out, 4 months out. So when you're creating a culture like that, what's your, I guess, advice to people listening that want to implement that within their athletes? Or is it just...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
my advice is this. For one, I never talk about numbers with my lifters. I never talk about the number they need to hit because it's irrelevant, right? It's not their job to know the number. It's my job, right? When we go to the meet, I need to know what we're going to AO3 and we'll have probably 4, 5. I have 5 girls that have a legit shot at being on the world team. One of them's on the world team. Melissa's going to make the team for sure. I've got 4 other girls that have a legit shot, if they do everything right, of possibly getting on the world team, barring, obviously, who knows what everyone else is doing. But they don't need to know what those totals are to hit. They don't need to know those numbers. They just need to know that the performance is important, that they do the little things. So to start with that conversation with people, the first thing is that you have to have personal accountability and responsibility for yourself. If you don't have that, you can't do anything. So the first step is taking ownership of who you are and what you're doing. And from there, it then becomes it becomes something that's on you. Once you have personal responsibility and ownership of what you're going to do, it's all about, well, it's my job to make this technique better. It's my job to correct my mistakes and do it right. I better focus on every single thing I'm doing today that I can do well, that doesn't take, anything more than effort and focus, and do it well. And then you build from there, and you really focus on like, hey, the most important thing is the next thing you're going to do, right? Put your effort and energy into that. If it goes well, it goes well. If it doesn't, then we evaluate and we adjust and we go on from there. But that's the basic foundation of anything that anybody that's going to be successful is taking personal responsibility for it. And then, above and beyond that is just educating people about what process orientation really is, and getting them to focus on the process of getting better, not just the details or the big picture.
All right, very interesting. So, Max, I have a few questions, pre-written questions that I like to ask to every person that comes on the show. And everyone I usually bring on, they have a long history with resistance training or strength training. So, besides the physical enhancements, besides the fact that strength training builds muscle, it improves bone density and all of those other qualities, do you think it would be useful for everyone to resistance train? And what has adopting that habit done for you?
Yeah, I think everyone would benefit from some kind of resistance training. Every single person will benefit from it. Was it done for me? I mean, it's, my entire life has been focused on this. So basically anything good that's happened to me or anything bad that's happened to me that I grew from is entirely related to weightlifting. I mean, I started when I was 12, and I was just possessed from that age. Like that's what I was going to do. So, I mean, it's done great things and bad things, but both of them have been worthwhile experiences.
So in terms of looking back at not only your athletic career, but your coaching career up to now, what are your best and worst memories? Maybe one as an athlete and one as a coach, or
That's a tough question. There's a lot of shitty things that we've done happen. Oh man, I will say, no one's ever actually asked me this on a podcast. I would say probably the best moment of coaching, one of my best moments in coaching. That's a tough one. I don't want to say it was any one particular person's performance, because those are like, those are moments in time relative to hundreds of hours of training. So it's not like, oh yeah, when that guy or girl made that snatch, that was like awesome. Because it's like a culmination of everything, right? It's not like that's the moment that was great. It's the effort put in. But I will say that, like, one of the probably one of the best experiences I had, one of my favorite experiences, was being able to train with people that I looked at as, as icons, and that like training with Abdjayev was like this thing that really meant something to me when I went and did it. And it was like, I'm grateful for that opportunity, because, that was like, to have met somebody that you idolize like that, it's rare. As far as bad, shit. I mean, Fuck, there's a lot of bad ones. You know, bad from like things I fucked up. I mean, I can think of a bunch of times I've probably made stupid calls or something like that, but you know, and I don't want to be the kind of person who like, you know, puts something on someone else. I mean, I will say this, right? Any situation you have with people, you got to be really careful about judging them because you don't know where someone's coming from. You know, having a girl fail a drug test after breaking a record, like, you know, you don't know exactly where a person's coming from in life. You don't know what their background is, exactly what they're dealing with every day when they go to sleep. You know what keeps them up at night. Like, who knows? You can only judge them for the actions they take, right? There's definitely been people that I've been around that I'm glad to not be around anymore. And there's times where I feel like, man, I really fucked up that relationship, or I fucked up that situation because I didn't live up to my end of the deal, or I didn't take ownership of my own decisions, or I made bad choices. I can't think of any one particular time that's like, I mean, there's so fucking many of them that like, I mean, we'll just call it the last 10 years of my coaching career, I guess. That's a tough one.
Okay. And just kind of touching on that best memory thing with Ivan, I know it's maybe not as unique, but I actually spent some time in Kansas with Glenn Penley, training with him and looking up to him in the Cal Strength days and then that Muscle Driver and then everything he's put out. Like, that was an honor for me, so I can kind of get where you're coming from, and it just talking to him and kind of having him, I don't want to say as a mentor, but just be a guy I can always talk to and go to with questions it's unbelievable. I mean, it's really awesome that those people are so open to just creating relationships.
You know, Glenn is, I don't know how Glenn, I don't know exactly what Glenn's doing right now. I know he's still coaching. I saw him at American Open last year. But Glenn comes from like that old school, like that older time. You know, Glenn and I remember Glenn from 15, probably 18 years ago, maybe more than that now. You know, his name and stuff. And like, so like the idea of giving free information to people is like totally normal. Like, and I've never actually, if someone sends me a message on Instagram or Facebook or email, like I always answer it, you know, unless I don't see it. But, you know, and for the longest time, I didn't even know that like some messages get filtered. So, like, you know, there was probably like a dozen messages on there. I'm like, oh, it's like 3 years old. But like, you know, people like that are giving, they give that information out. They don't, you know, Glenn is a good coach. Glenn has coached a lot of great people. And, you know, he's got his way of doing it, his system, and he applies it and he does a good job with it. And he's willing to share that and, you know, be really open-minded and, you know, discuss this, that, and the other. And, hey, here's what I do. What do you do? And I think that's the kind of thing that you want to look for in a mentor, is somebody who cares about learning as much as they care about helping. Some people will just, you know, crank out information and put stuff out there and constantly build something up, but they don't actually have an interest in learning themselves. Or they say they do, but maybe they don't. They're just trying to sell something or make a buck. You know, it's tough. It's like, I understand. It's like everybody has to keep going. Everybody has to do something, but finding mentors that are genuinely interested in learning as much themselves as they are in sharing what they know. You know, I think it's important. So,
yeah. And kind of looking at the amount of information that's out there. And one thing I want to applaud you for doing, and it's very obvious because you've been a part of creating very successful athletes. With the amount of information out there, how are you able to consume it and then kind of distill it down to what's useful and then implement it? Because for people that aren't aware, you can read just so much information about weightlifting and programming and technique that it's sickening. There's so much out there. And it might not all be accurate or applicable, but when you're looking at a book or like a textbook or some of the Russian manuals and you're reading that, what's your process look like like when you're distilling it down and then implementing it?
Well, the first thing you got to do is realize that it's written by a person, a human being, and it's going to have, it's going to have whatever is behind that, involved in it. Everything you read, you should have I don't want to say skeptical sense of, but you should read things for what they are, right? Read the Russian manuals, read whatever book it is, but understand that, like, for one, it's very difficult to convey a lot of information with words on a page. So some things are going to sound, like they're made very concise, and they'll get lost in translation or lost in the fact that, like, you have to say it a certain way when you're writing. So concept maybe is, things are diluted a little. It's like, you got to understand that, like, what you're reading might not be the full picture because it's too difficult to explain that in a book. What is written is what someone chose to write down, right? And they may have had to make that choice by eliminating other things, right? So every book that's read, everything is like, oh, you're reading someone's ideas, someone's thoughts. It's part of it, and you should learn that and take it, internalize it, and understand it. And then, what can I gain from this? What can I learn from this? And what is it that I do and don't understand? And what is it that I don't agree with? And that's fair enough. It's important to have a healthy level of both those things, skepticism and belief in it, and then just go from there. I mean, every book I've ever read has been, it's the same process. You read a bunch, you internalize it, you think about it, and you think, well, what can I do with this? How does this help? Is this person inspiring me to think about something, or are they just kind of trying to, explain something that I already know, or that, they're explaining something, that's, or maybe they're not explaining something, they're just saying something that really doesn't need to be said. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think a lot of people might be under the misconception that when you read something written by a figure that's respected for what they know, that you have to implement that information because they said that it's that way. But I've had good friends where I'll read something they say and I don't agree with it and I don't implement it, and that's just the way it is. You can't incorporate everything because your methods would be changing so frequently.
Right.
You don't even know what's happening, what the outcome is going to be, what caused the outcome.
For sure. A lot of people fall into one of those two categories too, where they might take on too much, or they might just look for reaffirmation in what they're already doing. Oh yeah, this is just like what I do. And maybe it's very different. You look at the Russian system or Russian text and you're like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, we do 75% also. Like, same thing. It's all good. Like whereas like, yeah, if you actually like read it and you think, oh, okay, this is like a cool way of, this is how they came to, this is how they came to these conclusions, and this is why they do this. And, oh, that's a cool idea. Like, I never thought about, calculating things this way or that way. Like, I never really, did this or did that. It's like, read something with the intent of trying to learn something about it. I guess the way to say it.
Yeah, and you were talking about periodizing recovery before, and I think one thing that stood out in Bob Takano's book for programming for weightlifting is he talked about how the Russians would periodize their time in like the sauna or using contrast therapy or something like that. And I think what I took away from that is just the attention to detail. It's not that I'm going to implement that practice, but the way they were able to track it and write it down in a way that made sense and you could follow verbatim was incredibly interesting. So in terms of resources, I'm going to do this a bit selfishly for training, programming, and then also weightlifting technique. What would you recommend to the listeners as maybe your top 3 resources, besides obviously your books would get the plug there, the technique triad, and then strength development for weightlifting, which I have a slight bone to pick with you. The editing on that technique triad was cringeworthy.
That. The guy who edited it, I think he speaks English as a second language. He insists he doesn't, but that was the editing on that was just. I think what happened was it was the first one we wrote, and it was I was under the impression that the guy who was going to format it was going to edit it first.
Oh, okay.
And what happened is it didn't get edited, and it got edited, but very, very badly. My apologies for that. I tell that to everybody who buys it. Like, get past that and just listen to the idea is more like a concept, right?
Yeah.
That's what I tried to do with all the books is just like, I'm not going to say anything new that anybody hasn't read about weightlifting. That's obvious. It's all out there. But hey, here's a different perspective. Maybe think about something in a different way, and maybe that'll inspire somebody else to create something different that hasn't been discovered yet. Same with other things. Like the strength book is more about like, hey, it's not the best strength program in the world. It's just an example of how to take principles and turn it into a program, how to develop a system and understand that you need to have some kind of methodology that bridges the gap between theory and practice. But as far as like technique and training the best books, there was a good book by, I mean, obviously the Russian texts are really good. The Snatch and Clean and Jerk as a technical model is a really good book. I think the Roman's book is a really good book for learning the Russian system, or his version of that. I would say, outside of that, I haven't read a ton of weightlifting books in the last year, but I would say that there's a good book by, I can't remember the coach, Enver Turkalari, the guy who found Naeem, had a good book that I read maybe a couple of years ago. I don't remember the name of it. I don't even know if there was a title to it. It was translated though. And then, I'm sure that Bob's book is good. Takano's book is good on programming from that standpoint. I don't know. I can't think of anything I've read recently that I would say is like the go-to book for training. It seems like no one really writes books as much anymore, especially about technique. So much more of that content is video. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say again, I kind of share that sentiment. Everything I feel like I'm putting out in terms of content, I just feel like I'm repeating things I've heard from people that are much smarter and much more experienced, and I realize that a lot of these concepts aren't necessarily new. It's just the way they're applied.
Right.
And if you say them in a certain way, someone else is going to understand them. So when I brought you on, it's with the recognition that you've been on so many podcasts and produced so many YouTube videos and written so many articles and books and all these things. But maybe we just talk about these concepts in a way that's unique, and then people can understand them differently. So that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's oh, here you go.
Oh, I was just going to go into the other question. So this is kind of like the philosophical question. The whole show is about weightlifting, and then we have one question of philosophy. So I figured that's a way to round it out. So
okay.
What is one thing that people can do each day to become a better person?
This is an easy one. Be grateful. Gratitude. There's a motto. The motto we have that we stole from someone else is grateful for everything, entitled to nothing.
Ooh.
And gratitude, I think, is the most important thing for people to start off their day. To walk around and to stop and think about, what can I be grateful for, and how can I show that gratitude to the people around me? Can I do something that helps the people around me become more productive? Can I do something that shows that I appreciate what I have? And then at the same time, how do I avoid the belief that I'm entitled to something? So yeah, that would be that.
That's great. I love that. And I know as a coach and you also understand this, but we're kind of in the business of just helping people, right? Helping people reach their goals and develop their athleticism. And it's kind of unique in that. So Max, I want to thank you for coming on. I think it was an excellent episode. I'm glad we were able to cover some stuff I hadn't really thought about in those ways. And I appreciate your time. I'm sure the people listening do too.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of your content, where would you direct people if they want to read more about your coaching methods, your history with the Bulgarians, or any of that good information that's out there?
You can find most of that on the Juggernaut YouTube page. You could see some of my stuff on Instagram, Max_Aita. I don't post a whole lot on there. I'm just not a real Instagram savvy guy. And then, you could look on Facebook or even email me if you have questions. Feel free, max@jtsstrength.com.
Yeah, and I will say, you responded like almost immediately after I sent that. So he'll get back to you if you have any questions. As he said, feel free to reach out. And Thanks again, guys, for checking out another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, share the podcast. It all helps the show grow. And we will catch you next time.